Thanks for the introduction. Always have to do this, I'm a little bit vertically challenged. So I'm an ecologist, and in particular my research is native bee conservation. And I'm always amazed in the academic sphere how there's always this big gap when ecologists talk about biodiversity conservation, and they seem to ignore the impact of animal agriculture. So today I'll be talking to you a little bit about how animal agriculture impacts biodiversity based on a publication that I wrote that was published in Austral Ecology. Really bring it out there into the academic sphere about how we really need to focus on our lifestyle choices if we are going to halt the biodiversity decline. So as probably most of you know, biodiversity is not doing very well. We're in an era of unprecedented species declines and extinctions, and in Australia we hold the record of one of the countries that has the most extinctions of mammals of all countries in the world over the past 200 years. No other country has had so many mammals become extinct. And this has been going on for a long time, even before European colonisation. One of the greatest megafauna extinctions happened, again due to hunting and lifestyle changes. And we used to have wombats the size of cars. We used to have giant kangaroos, giant lizards, and they were all extinct. And now, as we are in an era where we know a lot more about how actions can impact biodiversity, there's still so many people out there not aligning their research with their lifestyle and dietary choices. So one of the biggest causes of extinctions is habitat loss. And one of the biggest causes of habitat loss is livestock agriculture. In Queensland, so much natural vegetation is cleared for livestock, but we seem to think that land clearing only occurs outside of Australia, in the Amazon, which again is a place where livestock agriculture is one of the main causes of habitat destruction. But it's all been swept under the carpet and not really publicised very much. So livestock agriculture is a cause of habitat loss, but it also interferes with many other biodiversity processes that are endangering species worldwide. So in addition to habitat loss, climate change. This is one of the major increasing, threatening processes causing declines and again extinction of biodiversity due to increased greenhouse gas emissions. And again, almost all the research and the publicised causes is due to cars and fossil fuels, which they are definitely a huge issue. But livestock agriculture is another major cause through land clearing, which takes out trees, which are major drawing down of the carbon in the atmosphere. So if you've seen livestock pastures, there's not many trees, which is actually a real issue for the livestock themselves, a welfare issue since they don't have much shade, and this is a big issue in Australia. But then the livestock themselves, they're at unnatural densities. We've never had cattle and sheep at such high densities across the planet. Now, cattle and sheep, they are foregut fermenters, and this means that when they ruminate, they release a lot of methane, and this methane is a greenhouse gas, and it's even more potent than carbon dioxide. It's at lower concentrations, but it hangs around in the atmosphere for a lot longer. So we've got a lot of greenhouse gas emissions from livestock themselves. Then there are all those other emissions that don't sort of be talked about as well. So livestock, they need to be transported to slaughterhouses, then there's the refrigeration processes, there's the transport of meat from slaughterhouses to supermarkets. So all this really adds up to the amount of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. And research has found that diet can make a huge impact on cutting your carbon footprint. So by eliminating meat from your diet, that's already almost cutting your carbon footprint by 50% compared with an typical Western diet, which probably shouldn't be a typical Western diet. And going vegan can cut it by 50%. So people always asking, how can we address the climate crisis? And there's so many ways that we can, but one of the most simplest ways that everyone can address it is just through their diets, and it's a very simple way that we can do this. Now, it's very, I guess, obvious to most of the people in this room, but it's still a big gap in public understanding and even among academia. So 2 years ago, I think in 2018, when we could still travel and had conferences, I went to the Ecological Society of Australia conference talking about my native bee research. And the conference organisers, for probably the first conference I've ever been to, they were selling, the catering was everything plant-based. And I thought that was amazing. And so what I did was I tweeted and I said, thank you to the Ecological Society of Australia. It's great that you're aligning your values with the scientific knowledge. And I thought that was a normal tweet. I got back to my hotel room and I had so many angry ecologists who were at the conference basically ripping into me for saying that. And I think one of the attendees wrote a blog post about me, sort of ripping into me for just saying that as ecologists, we should be going plant-based if we actually want to make a difference and, conserve the species that we are studying, that we are all dedicating our lives to studying and conserving. And yeah, it was a big shock for me, and made me realize that it's an issue that we need to really put out there. And then so my specialty is native bees, and I give a lot of presentations about native bees in Australia. We've got 2,000 species, and sadly, many of them are not doing very well. And so when I talk about native bees, I talk about how we can serve them, planting the flowers that they need, making sure they have nesting habitat. And then I get to, these actions are great, but not everyone has a garden. Some people live in apartments. There is something that everyone can do to make a huge difference to native bees. Probably the biggest thing that we can do, and that's going plant-based, because it addresses habitat loss, which is the major cause of bee endangerment, and climate change, which is impacting bees especially through causing mismatches in the phenology of when plants are flowering, when the bees are emerging, causing the nectar and pollen chemistry to become less nutritious, causing mismatches between where is the thermal optimum for plants versus the bees, because they need to both either adapt or migrate. So when I bring this up, I've had times when I've been giving public talks and people loved it, the whole presentation, they've been sitting there smiling, and then when I start talking about this, I've had people get up and leave, and I'm like, okay, wow. And then I've had other presentations where I gave a presentation in Esperance, and Esperance is a cattle farming region. I didn't realize that, and after my talk, some lady who owned a cattle farm decided to come up and give me a lecture about how her farm was actually great for bees, and I was like, oh, really? Okay. So yeah, there's obviously this big disconnect between the public. Everyone wants to save the bees, but when you start talking to them about how they actually can save the bees, they can become less enthusiastic about it, which is, it's really sad. But there are, though, lots of people that when I have given these talks and presentations and start talking about, hey, this is a big issue and you can actually do something about it. There are people that have been like, I actually didn't think about that. I always think about, we just need to plant flowers and it'll be fine. But there's these bigger global issues that is a great thing that all of us can actually make a huge difference. As I said, you can cut your carbon footprint by 50%. So livestock agriculture has an impact on bees, and we can make a huge difference in saving the bees. But livestock agriculture also impacts on biodiversity in other ways. So in Australia in particular, we are a landscape that has evolved for hundreds of thousands of years without hoofed animals. Our soils are very old, very weathered, and then when we put high densities of hoofed animals on them, they cause some major issues with soil, and we're becoming increasingly aware that our soil is so important for the whole entire ecosystem. It provides the nutrients for the plants to grow, then the animals need the plants. So when you've got lots of hoofed animals, they cause soil compaction. This means that the water can't infiltrate the soils as much. It can lead to soil salinization, and then we've also got the issue of, because we haven't had livestock on the land, cow patties, so cow poop basically. We have such an issue with cow poop that we've had to introduce beetles to clean up all the poop, and this is also not very good for the soil, and they are also spreading weeds. So Australia has major weed problems, and buffel grass in the Northern Territory, for example, is a massive environmental weed, and many of these weeds are spread through feces. So that's another way that livestock is causing some major biodiversity crisis in terms of weed spread. Then there's also eutrophication. So eutrophication is when there's excess nutrients going into waterways, and it causes algal blooms. When the algae die, then the bacteria consume them at the bottom of the lake, and it leads to depletions of oxygen, which causes fish die-offs. And eutrophication can also alter the species composition of waterways. Now, again, a big issue that we're all aware of in Australia is the Great Barrier Reef. It's dying. Coral bleaching. Now, one of the major causes of this is climate change, so livestock are involved in that, but also eutrophication. Now, the excess nutrients, coral is actually interesting in that they don't need a lot of nutrients. The algae, which compete with the coral, need lots of nutrients. So when you put lots of nutrients into the waterways, which are washed off, because in Queensland, it's a major cattle region, when this is washed off into the ocean, this favours the algae, and so when the coral are already stressed, they then get taken over by algae, and you've just got these algae areas where the beautiful thriving coral in these communities are no longer there. The excess nutrients also favours the crown of thorns starfish, which is another major cause of the coral dying in the Great Barrier Reef. So again, lots of us are aware that the Great Barrier Reef is dying and that coral bleaching is an issue, but then this key factor that influences many of these things causing coral reefs to die is just not mentioned. And so there we have another issue. Now, livestock agriculture also interacts with another issue in Australia, which is persecution of apex predators. So dingoes are our main apex predator. Historically, we used to have other apex predators, marsupial lions, marsupial tigers. These are obviously not tigers or lions because they're marsupials. That's a common name. Thylacines used to occur on the mainland. We used to have a rich biodiversity of apex predators. Now, sadly, these became extinct with hunting by the original Indigenous Australians and their fire practices. So along with the megafauna that the apex predators preyed upon, we have these mass extinctions. Now today, the dingo is our only real apex predator, as well as eagles. But the dingoes play really important roles in controlling introduced cats and foxes. This is called mesopredator control. So in landscapes where there are more dingoes, there are fewer cats and foxes, there are more native marsupials. Now, dingoes, unfortunately, are subjected to being killed mainly by farmers who, ironically, are killing the dingoes so that they can kill the cattle and the sheep. It doesn't make much sense, but that's how it is. And these dingoes, they play massive roles in the ecosystem. There's been a lot of publicisation of the role of wolves, for example, in Yellowstone in North America. Similar situation here in Australia, where we need these dingoes to have a balanced ecosystem. But as I mentioned, they are being persecuted and shot by farmers. Now, farmers also, livestock farmers will kill species that are considered threatened. One of the key ones are wombats. So wombats, they are really important ecosystem engineers. When they dig, they turn over the soil, they aerate the soil, they turn over nutrients, and they ensure that these weathered soils can still support plant life and productivity. So this digging process is really important. But farmers don't like big holes in their cattle pastures because cattle can break a leg if they fall in. So wombats are actually killed in many of the areas where cattle occur. So it's, when you look into it, it's amazing how many of these major biodiversity issues that are facing species in Australia are all linked back to livestock agriculture. So it's a major problem, but I guess it means that it's something that we can actually all solve. There are many other ways that we can help reduce these threats, but encouraging people to go plant-based can do a huge difference to protecting our species that are going into decline, and we don't have much time left. So there is a positive movement that I am seeing. For example, we're having this expo right now, and there's more awareness that almost every time that you post something about defending biodiversity through dietary choices, there's this big backlash. And so my article, when I published it in Ecology, that was published in the academic sphere, and I was really happy about that because Ecology is like Australia's leading ecology journal. And I also wrote a press release for it, so that for the general public. And when I was writing it, I wrote it through my university, and the media team, they contacted me and they were like, "Oh, shouldn't we have like a little paragraph here saying how there's benefits of eating meat?" And I was like, "What? No, that's not what this article is about. That's also not supported." People are scared to tell the truth about the impact that our lifestyle choices have on biodiversity extinction. It's a very hot topic, biodiversity extinction, climate change, and it seems like everyone wants to do something, which is great. People are becoming more aware and about the impact of climate change and the need to halt biodiversity loss. But then these quite simple solutions, they still are met with so much opposition. So part of it, I think, is really focusing on how this is something that we can do as a collective. So rather than saying that, looking at someone individually and be like, your diet is causing species to go extinct, that's just going to create a lot of adversity, I think. But trying to make it something that everyone is involved in, everyone contributes to, because that is ecology in essence. It's about interactions between all of us, between the animals, the plants, the soils. We're all interconnected, so what we do is going to impact upon the planet, and that's going to impact again back on us. So if you have any questions about biodiversity, conservation, or any experiences. I'd love to hear your thoughts and have a little bit of a discussion with you as well. So have you experienced any backlash when you've talked about the impact of diet on climate change or biodiversity or conservation? How have you even heard of this in like the media, or is this still something that you haven't really experienced when there's not really much out there drawing these links between the interconnectedness between the planet and how we live our lives? Any stories that anyone has to share? Yeah? So that's a really good question. What are some positive things that are happening? And yeah, I think we really need to emphasize these wins as well, because you're right, there's always so much negativity and the planet is going to shits, and I don't think that inspires people very much. It can just make people apathetic. So fortunately, there are a lot of wins in biodiversity and conservation organisations that are doing good things. So in terms of, there's some organisations in terms of mammals, it's called Arid Recovery, and what they're doing is they're putting up enclosures, called predator-proof enclosures, where the bilbies and the bettongs, they can be safe from the introduced predators like cats and foxes. Now there's also really good captive breeding programs at Perth Zoo, so if we can keep it local. The western swamp tortoise, it's very threatened from climate change. This tortoise is evolutionarily unique. It was thought to be extinct. No one had seen it for 30 years, and then a little boy found this tortoise, and he was like, he was like only 11 or something, and they realized that it was this extinct tortoise. So then this really dedicated captive breeding program at Perth Zoo was started, and I think they've bred by now, it was like over 500 little tortoises. So from a handful, the species being brought back from the brink, and then they realized, where it occurs now, climate change, they rely on swamps, and swamps are a very threatened habitat by climate change. So they've been modelling the suitability of different habitats for it and translocating it into these new areas so that it can still be safe from climate change. So that's a really great, wonderful success story. We've also got success stories in, I guess I'm a bit biased here, but bee conservation. So when I started my PhD project, which was looking at native bees in urban areas and how we can conserve them, no one knew that we even had native bees in Australia. It seemed like everyone I talked to, they were like, I saw a big colony of bees in my tree, those are the native bees, right? I was like, oh, well, actually they're feral honeybees, not the native bees. But over the past 5 years, there's now been native bee conferences. There has been, recently Woolworths put out like a pollinator program and for schools, and schools have been contacting me to do workshops on how we can help save the native bees by making bee hotels. There's been a grant that was put out by the federal government for bushfire recovery. So as we know, fires have recently decimated biodiversity, so it's now more than ever that we really need to address climate change, reduce habitat clearing. And one of the projects, I put forward a proposal to do workshops and make bee hotels and install them in areas that have been affected by fire so that the native bees have somewhere to nest, because lots of them nest in trees, and so the trees were destroyed by the fires, so they've still got somewhere to nest. So there's some really good positive stuff happening in the native bee world. And then for conservation of birds, for example, there's been another sort of like rediscovery. So Australia thought that a night parrot, we had this species called a night parrot, they thought it had gone extinct, but there's been increasing sightings of this parrot. So there's hope out there. There's so much hope out there, and there are actually a lot of people that are dedicated to saving these species and researching how we can better protect them and using evidence-based approaches. So yeah, there's some good stuff happening.
One more question related to diversity of genes, because if you have like animals which are almost extinct, so they like only a small amount of them, and they kind of have space to reproduce again, there's still like really small amount of difference between like genes. How important is like the diversity in genes to grow the population healthy?
Yeah, so genetic diversity is really important, and so when you have a population reduced to a really small size, they can become low genetic diversity, which means it's harder for them to adapt to changes in the environment like climate change. It can lead to inbreeding depression. Now it's like an ongoing debate in conservation about how much genetic diversity is needed. It seems to vary a lot by species. So they've looked at some species that are not endangered, they've got good population size, and they have very low genetic diversity. There's even salamanders that are essentially like all clones of each other, and they're a still healthy population. But then there's other species that they found. For example, tigers are a good example, and they suffer from inbreeding depression. So it will vary by the species, but when you've got low genetic diversity, it means it's very important to reduce as many other threatening processes and increase the population size, because when there's more individuals, there's more chance that there will be good mutations, beneficial mutations to create genetic diversity that natural selection can work on, and these good mutations won't be lost by genetic drift. So that is an issue when populations become too small, but it's going to vary by the species, and it does mean that we need to be extra careful in increasing our abatement of the other interacting threats. Yeah. Yes? That question was about glyphosate. It's because there has been mixed studies, so they've not always found that it has a negative impact, and it's very hard to demonstrate negative impacts when there's multiple interacting causes. So I think definitely in gardens and urban areas, you don't need to use herbicides. So glyphosate is a herbicide, and in a way it's better than some of the previous ones that were very toxic, but there's been increasing studies that have found that it does appear to, when they apply it at levels that are unrecommended, it can have negative effects. So yeah, there are studies on this, and there has been mixed results. but yeah, in like daily practices, it's something that we do. If we want to, you know, eliminate weeds or tackle weeds, there are other options, and the best thing to do is just plant lots of, you know, native plants, and the glyphosate and pesticides and herbicides are mainly used in agricultural contexts when they're wanting a monoculture of a crop, which is bad for biodiversity in general. So a diversity of native plants is always a better thing to have. I've done research in Tasmania in apple orchards, and almost all the native bees are on the native vegetation or on the weeds, you know, throughout the orchard. So yeah, it's something that isn't needed, and can have, you know, adverse impacts when it's used unjudiciously. Yeah. Great question about how to deal with when you've got these confrontations. And I think with people that it's going to depend on the context. So in academia, I basically just throw like a shitload of articles, you know, peer-reviewed articles that have been published in Science or in Nature, so like the top tier journals, being like, here is publications. And that's what my publication, Defending Biodiversity Through Our Diets, I got all the literature and just put it together, and I was like, you know, here's all the evidence. So that doesn't, I guess, work it only works, I guess, in like an online format. You can't be like, hey, well, there's this like paper in Nature. So it will depend, and there's also some people that just don't give a shit about science. So finding out their values. So that's why when you're dealing with people in academia, they value peer-reviewed evidence, and so getting the articles that support your argument. But then in other contexts, it might be people that care about their health, and you can be like, well, you know, for example, with coronavirus, we wouldn't have coronavirus right now if people didn't like keep animals in inhumane conditions to then like sell them at wet markets. So finding out, you know, some people are very concerned about viruses and coronavirus, and then you can be like, well, you know, all these major pandemics, swine flu, bird flu, all this is linked to agriculture. So looking at what people value, some people might value, you know, be concerned about fires and bushfires, and then climate change is obviously linked to agriculture. So you can, yeah, finding out what people value, and, you know, showing how they can make, rather than saying they're doing a bad thing, saying how they can make a massive positive difference by doing this good thing. So just, it's essentially saying the same thing, but just in a different valence. Yeah, putting it in a positive way. Yeah. That was about honey and whether it's ethical. So, interestingly, most native bees don't make honey. None of the native bees in southwest Western Australia make honey. So, if we're looking at honeybees, I think it can be done ethically. So, honey is basically surplus nectar that they store in the hive. And beekeepers, if they took the honey that the bees need, the honeybee colony would die. So it's actually, and they do a lot to make sure that the bees have enough nutrition. if the bees, if there's a drought, they will supplementary feed the bees with sugar water and pollen mixes. So in terms of that, it can be done ethically. But then in the bigger context, so one of my research topics was looking at the impact of honeybees on our native bees, because honeybees are an introduced species and they can actually have negative impacts on our native bees through competing for limited resources. So it's when there's not enough native flowering vegetation, for example, when there's been land clearing or when there's been droughts, then honeybees, they live in big colonies. Most of our native bees are solitary. And honeybees can communicate the best sources of flowers. They can outcompete native bees, not in all cases, but in some cases. And so because of this, it would be a good idea to limit the density of honeybee colonies. The main ones that are issues are the feral honeybee colonies, because they take over hollows in trees that the native parrots and possums need. So from that point of view, that sort of ethical side, limiting how many beekeepers there are is a good idea. So that's actually a really good question and a very, very complex topic. But yeah, those are some of the sort of things that we need to think about. And it's all about, like, rather than focusing on one little thing, like thinking about all the interacting factors that are involved. Yeah. Yes? Among my scientific colleagues, it's actually I think it's bigger than I thought, and I think lots of people don't publicise it, I guess because of the unfortunately negative stigma. And sadly, I think veganism, even though it's supported by science in terms of the impact on ecology, there's still very this stereotype of a vegan as being I don't say this in a bad way, but a hippie, just not scientific based, a lot of just pseudoscience and that sort of thing. So this negative stereotype of veganism, I think, is why lots of people don't really say that they are. But my PhD supervisor, he is, I feel bad about guessing his age, but in his 60s, and that seems to be the boomer age group that are the most anti-vegetarian vegan. So I was really surprised by that. And even other ecologists, if they're not, they'll be yeah, I realise that livestock agriculture is bad, and I'm reducing my meat intake, which is a great thing. I think ongoing gradual change is more important than just a few people going vegan, everyone being part of the movement and just going towards it. But again, sometimes I'm not sure whether I'm in my little bubble. And I think maybe many of us here, we because of the sort of and aggressive tactics of some people that don't like hearing about the impact of livestock agriculture, or the poor welfare that sadly many animals are subjected to, then we sort of shield ourselves from that. So, but I do think it is, even people aren't vegan, there are quite a few ecologists that are plant-based and moving towards it. And then given that the Ecological Society of Australia, as a society representing Australia, they decided to have plant-based meals. Hopefully they didn't think twice about it after all the Twitter hate that my tweet caused. It does suggest that it is on the agenda, and when I published my article, I was very scared that I would get some really like nasty comments, but mostly it was other academics emailing me and be like, thank you for raising this issue. So yeah, it was actually good. I didn't get any like death threats or something. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming and listening to this, and it means a lot to have your support and interest in how we can all like make a difference about conserving biodiversity, because obviously I've dedicated like my life to researching this and how we can save the bees, and so thanks everyone for making a massive difference in protecting like the amazing biological diversity that we have on this planet through your lifestyle choices. So thank you.